What's up, my friends, my Canadian cousins, my neighbors north of the border, those whom I appreciate so much. So I had a comment by somebody in Western Canada, I believe British Columbia, if my memory serves, that suggested that it seems I do most of my videos reacting to the history of Eastern Canada. And I think maybe that's a fair comment. I did do a video early on about the Pig War dispute over an island off of Vancouver Island between the United States and Britain in the wake of their compromise over the Oregon Territory, but that was very early on. And since then, yeah, there probably hasn't been that much, and it was not intentional. So fair comment, and I think in order to explore some Western topics, one of the first things I ought to do is look at the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And you know what? You all know, those of you who have watched my channel before, I do like to tie in music with cultural and historical events where I can. The great Canadian folk artist Gordon Lightfoot did a song, the Canadian Railway Trilogy, or Railroad Trilogy. I do have it on a vinyl album. I'm going to listen to it after I do this reaction, where I'm going to make a separate video on it so you can watch it. If you are so inclined, I will put a link in the description so that we can really pay close attention to it after having looked at the history here. So without further ado, my friends, let us get into the history of the Canadian Pacific Railway.
1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed. It consisted of 4 provinces: Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. Within 4 years, the new country had grown past the shore of Lake Huron, through the vast prairies to the Pacific Ocean. The new country now stretched from sea to sea, but it faced enormous challenges. The nation was divided, not just by culture, traditions, and language, but also by geography. Something new was needed if the country was to unify itself and keep its claims in the Western Territories. Politicians would find the solution in a revolutionary piece of technology. They called it the Iron Horse.
Sorry for the quality of the video. It's a little choppy. It's the source material, so there's nothing I can do about it, but so far I'm enjoying the content.
Connecting the country would not be easy. Financing a project of such scale would require millions of dollars, and the labor would be substantial. But it was essential, according to Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. McDonald. His vision was the Transcontinental Railway. Until this great work is complete, our Dominion is little more than a geographic expression, he told the House of Commons. He feared that Western Canada and the interests of the Hudson Bay Company were in jeopardy. Without a steel backbone holding the country together, Canada would remain disjointed and weak. He asked...
In jeopardy from the United States, I understand. In studying Canadian history since I did this, right? The concept of the American Manifest Destiny concerned Canada, that the spread west by the United States wouldn't stop in east to west, but would go north, and particularly if Canada wasn't able to protect the west. And I think that was a big motivation for John McDonald in pushing for the railroad.
Canadians where they stood. Would they be loyal to the Crown and Canada, or be swept away by American nationalism? 1871. A rail or coach road becomes conditional to the acceptance of British Columbia into the Union. The government worked quickly to promise British Columbia a railway within 10 years. The controversy was immense. Newspapers in the East took a stand against it. The terms on which the ministry has determined to bring British Columbia into the Union are monstrous and unparalleled in the history of Canadian legislation. One cannot feel otherwise than amazed at the recklessness of our legislatures to thus blindly committing the country to an undertaking that will certainly cost $100 million. Many felt...
Well, I mean, I can see that. Just knowing what it took to get the Transcontinental Railway built in the United States, the money, the resources, the political will, the abuse of immigrants to build it, the human costs, the political scandals, the corruption, it was massive. And of course, the United States was bigger with more economic power. So I can understand the fear and concern, but I can also understand why John McDonald and probably a lot of like-minded people thought it was absolutely essential to do it, no matter the cost, in order to preserve Canadian independence.
That British Columbia would eventually be annexed to the United States and could not justify the costly undertaking of a railway system. One MP from Halifax said, "Voting for the Pacific Railway would be a measure fraught with the greatest danger to the people of the Dominion." Despite opposition, British Columbia was accepted into Confederation. The threat of U.S. annexation was too great. Canada would get its railroad, but the controversy would continue.
So BC was accepted into Confederation prior to the railway being built, right? Did I understand that correctly?
The contract for the railway was awarded to Sir Hugh Allan, a shipping magnate from Montreal. On April 2, 1873, suspicions of a scandal were confirmed by the Liberal opposition. McDonald had granted Allan the railway contract in exchange for large campaign contributions. The building of the Canadian Pacific Railway was slowed. The scandal tainted the Prime Minister's reputation. Sir John A. Macdonald resigned. The unpopularity of the Conservative government led to a Liberal victory in the 1873 general election. Liberal Alexander Mackenzie became Prime Minister. North America was in the grips of an economic depression. Mackenzie believed the railway was no longer a priority. He was more fiscally minded and less willing to take expensive risks. His administration would only complete 700 miles of the Canadian Pacific, hardly enough to keep the project on track. The slow progress resulted in British Columbia threatening to secede from Confederation.
Really?
Canadians again began to fear for the sovereignty of Canada.
I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting. Well, there's a motivating factor. But yeah, you can understand that. I mean, British Columbia would have to have felt so isolated all the way out there. Yeah.
During the 1878 election, they would call for action. Conservative John A. Macdonald campaigned on his new national policy. He also promised to complete the Canadian Pacific Railway. He told voters his policies would unify and protect Canada from U.S. annexation. They believed him, and once again he became the Prime Minister of Canada.
Well, he's an astute politician. I wonder how real that concern was. I wonder whether... This is something I don't know. I know a lot about U.S. history, whether there was a real popular movement towards annexation of Canada or Western Canada at this time. I mean, just remember, we had just fought a devastating civil war, and we were consumed with reconstruction of the South, while at the same time building our own Transcontinental Railroad, which I think was completed in the late 1869 or 1870, something like that. So, yeah, and that was also just sort of right after the Civil War, and there was a lot of difficulties involved in that. So, in any case, I'll look it up at some point, but we're looking at history from a position of hindsight, so I'm not suggesting that even if there was not a real chance of the United States invading and taking over Canada, or just taking the western part of Canada, I can understand that in real time back then, the concern was real. And I'm sure there were some people who were in the United States clamoring for it. And then if you hear it, you're naturally going to be worried about it. But I'd love to know if you guys know a bit more about this.
It wouldn't be until 3 years later, on February 16, 1881, that the Canadian Pacific Railway was incorporated and construction began. The new contract was given to Donald Alexander Smith, a businessman with experience with the Hudson Bay Company. He would oversee the project from beginning to end. British Columbians embraced the coming railroad. One British Columbian newspaper, the British Colonist, exclaimed, "The railway is coming. The iron horse will soon cause the hills to tremble before his giant tramp. The outlook is very pleasant. Business must revive and the hopes of hundreds be realized. Empty houses will be filled, unoccupied lands tilled, new resources developed, old enterprises strengthened, and new ones inaugurated." The BC portion of the line was
That statement almost sounds a little bit like Canada had some manifest destiny tendencies of its own.
contracted to Andrew Underdog, an American railway engineer with considerable experience in the United States. Underdog would have the enormous task of bringing the line through some of the most challenging territory in all of the Dominion. Through unparalleled engineering, Underdog bridged extensive canyons and tunneled under dozens of mountains. The route through the mountains required special attention to dangerous winter conditions. Measures would need to be taken to protect the line during the harsh mountain winter.
So Underdog was American, I think he said. I wonder if he is drawing from some of the experiences that they had in building the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, which was just slightly earlier than this. It was kind of interesting that what they did was there were two companies, one coming from the east and one coming from the west, and they were paid by how many miles of rail track they put down, which incentivized them both to race towards getting the railroad done quickly, because they were sort of in competition with each other to who would lay the most rails, and they ultimately ended up meeting, I think, in Utah. But we had to do the same thing. I mean, we had the Rocky Mountains too, and so we had to get through the mountain passes.
Facing pressure from the government to keep costs down and construction swift, Underdog controversially turned to a cheap, alternative source of labor, the Chinese. Many British Columbians were against the use of Chinese men in construction. They wanted Canadian workers to settle in the West after the railway was built.
Very interesting, my friends, very interesting, because there's a parallel here in the building of our railroad. The railroad was built largely by, unemployed Civil War soldiers, by freed African Americans, former slaves, by Irish immigrants, and in the West, particularly by Chinese immigrants, and they were set to doing the most dangerous jobs in using explosives to blow up rock in order to dig tunnels and create mountain passes. And more Chinese immigrants died building the railroad than I think any single other group of people.
The Commission on Chinese Immigration was set up to debate the labor issue. In 1882, McDonald told the House of Commons, "It is simply a question of alternatives. Either you must have this labor, or you can't have the railway." Most members of Parliament agreed. Ottawa allowed Underdog to continue using Chinese labor. He recruited more than 15,000 men from China and California. Laborers on the new railway worked mostly by hand. The working conditions were often poor. Chinese workers were often given the most dangerous jobs on the line, the handling of highly unstable explosives and working on bridge and tunnels. Many Chinese workers became sick from exhaustion or scurvy. There was a popular saying that for every mile of track laid, a Chinese man died. There are no records of the actual number of Chinese fatalities. The Victoria colonists placed the estimate at 1,500.
What an interesting parallel between our two countries in building the railroad.
Some thought it was higher. 2 years after it began, the railway came close to running out of funding. To ensure the railroad would not be left abandoned, the McDonald government passed the Railway Relief Bill, which would grant the CPR a further $22.5 million. Despite the difficulty of the terrain and the cost of construction, the provinces of Canada were finally bridged together. The Canadian Pacific Railway was completed more than 5 years ahead of schedule.
I've seen this picture before.
The last spike
That's
of the
famous,
line
right?
was driven in Craiglachie, British Columbia on November 7, 1885. It would be hammered in by the Honorable Donald A. Smith. One newspaper recalled the event. He took the maul in hand to drive the last spike, and after missing it a few times, he drove it home amid cheers from all present. Time would show that the Canadian Pacific Railway helped to fill the vast lands in the west of the Dominion. It held an immense nation firmly together. One railway engineer remarked, "Our railroad construction is the reverse in this country from what it is in any other. They are built in other countries to take people out. Here, we build a railroad so that people may go into the wilderness and settle it up." It's been said that without railways, there would be and could be no Canada.
Sure, when you're dealing with vast amounts of territory like that, that's got to be the case. It was imperative. I can understand, building the railroad in the United States and Canada, Transcontinental Railroad, were both imperative, but for some of the same reasons and some very different reasons. And in Canada, in particular, the notion that it was essential to protect and preserve Canadian sovereignty and Canadian confederation into the West. Really good video. The quality wasn't great, but I don't care that much. I hope you're not bothered by it because I thought the content was wonderful. And I am now, I'm going to link in the description, as I said again, I'm going to do this right now myself, and it'll be a separate video for you to listen to the wonderful Gordon Lightfoot's Canadian Railroad Trilogy. And I'm going to listen very carefully, having just seen this history, because I think I will appreciate this song through a new lens that I didn't have before. So if you're so inclined, guys, join me there on that video as well. All right, thank you so much. Take care.